is CBS Eye on the World with John Batchelor. Here's John Batchelor.
This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. I welcome the historian and classicist Victor Davis Hanson of the Hoover Institution to reflect most recently on a new book, A New History of World War II, Stalin's War by Sean McMeekin, a professor at Bard College, because Victor is read into the theme of the book. We come to Victor's Second World Wars, published within these last years, and Victor and I had lengthy conversations about his revelations. But Professor McMeekin writes, it has always been a stretch to lump together all the wars on the globe between the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, September 31, and Japan's capitulation, September 45, as many historians are now conceding. Victor Davis Hanson's recent general history, the Second World Wars, illustrates the point, as does Anthony Beaver when he opens his own history, the Second World War, by conceding that it was, quote, an amalgamation of conflicts. In addition, the professor adds, it is even more of a stretch to blame them all on one man, a man who was not even in power in Germany when the Manchurian conflict erupted and who had been dead for 4 months when Japan surrendered. Victor, I come to you for your thoughts on this because it strikes me as helpful to understand what you and Anthony Beaver and others have discovered, that Hitler is the European story, but Stalin is the world island story, the Eurasian story. Does that seem in proportion to you? Good evening to you, Victor.
Good evening, John. Yeah, I think it is. I think and that was one of the themes of the Second World Wars that I wrote. When September 1st, 1939, there was a Polish war that both the Soviet Union and Hitler's Germany attacked Poland from different directions. But prior to that, there had been a Mongolian border war with the Soviet Union and Japan. Japan had been fighting since 1932-3 up in Manchuria. And then what we saw was a weird war in November 39 in Finland, and nobody quite knew the partners Stalin and Hitler were at odds over Finland. And then we had quiet, and people actually thought that it was all over with. Britain was at war, but it wasn't really fighting, and they were dropping leaflets and things. And then he invaded in succession the Netherlands, and then Norway, and then those were the Norwegian-Netherlands war, and then France and Belgium, Holland, and then all of a sudden sort of stopped, and then all of a sudden he went into Yugoslavia, and the next year, 41, all the time by the Blitz, and then he went into Greece, and he bombed Crete, and then they stopped. And people thought the war is over. And at this time, John, as a philologist, you could see that nobody really used the term World War I. It was called the Great War. But suddenly in 41, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union just a few months in April before had signed a non-aggression pact with Japan and concentrated on it, and then the attack on Pearl Harbor and Singapore, then we no longer refer to it as World War I, the war 20 years prior. It was no longer as the Great War. It was suddenly World War I, and this new thing at the end of 41 was called World War II. But nobody prior to that really had envisioned it that way. So diverse were these little wars. There weren't little, a lot of people died, but it didn't involve most of the people on the planet until the beginning of 42.
Professor McMeekin advances, and I have not finished the book. I've read the part about 1939, not quite 40 yet. He advances the idea that Stalin plotted to set the capitalist states against each other, Britain, France, and Germany, and plotted to set Japan against China because that would take the pressure off of his army that performed very badly in Finland, very badly. But in any event, Stalin was looking to gobble up territory, as he did with Poland, as he did with Finland once that war was resolved in some fashion. That Stalin wanted to stay out of the conflict in Western Europe, stay removed from it, and move in after Germany had rendered its Lebensraum. Does that strike you as a way to interpret this? Stalin is the driver?
No, it's absolutely correct. It's based on documents from the Wehrmacht, and it was known to the high command of the German military that the Soviet Union, that was one of the reasons why this non-aggression pact broke up, because they understood that Stalin, while he was giving them wheat, oil, fuel to attack Britain and Western Europe. His long-range plan was for Germany to be engaged in what they thought was a endless war of capitalist democracies against each other while they sat back. But what Stalin didn't anticipate was that he had helped Germany a little bit too much, at least he thought, and the war ended very quickly. And then he thought, oh my God, this was supposed to go on like World War I and kill 18, 20 million people, and now all of Europe has been overrun in less than a year. And Britain is all isolated and weak, and we've helped create a monster. And Hitler then, one of the reasons he went back and broke the Ribbentrop Pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, was that he said, you know, I know what Stalin is doing, and we're going to pay him back. And then, of course, he invaded the Soviet Union because Stalin had performed so dismally in Finland. They had wiped out the officer class in 38 and 39 with their cannibalization of the military. And most importantly, Stalin never really met the target dates in the mutual invasion of Poland in 39. So Hitler's way of thinking, they have no record of fighting very spectacularly once they're outside of the Soviet Union. But of course, he didn't carry that thought to its logical extent, i.e. Germany's going to be fighting inside the Soviet Union. And once you fight the Russians on Russian soil, it's a very different question than an expeditionary Russian army.
Now we come to the puzzle for me, London. Did London know of these machinations? And if they didn't know, it's puzzling how London behaved, because there was an opportunity for London to offer a mutual pact to Moscow before Germany. There was a chance of an alliance between Moscow and London. It didn't happen. There was also the possibility that France would offer a mutual non-aggression pact or a peace deal to Moscow, and it didn't happen. Stalin was worried about that because that would unhorse his idea of Germany attacking. Did the fact that London and Paris not come together with Moscow, whatever their price was, did that trigger the Second War in Europe, Victor?
In part, Germany had been nursed since World War I on one prime directive. You never, ever get into a two-front war. That's why we lost World War I. We would have won it, the German military said to Hitler, but we had to fight on two fronts. So this time, you either fight Russia, and after the Western democracies are defeated, which they thought they had done in 41, or you invade them when they're still, they're still viable, but only if you have a non-aggression pact with Stalin. And so that was the idea. Now, the Allies knew that, so they said to themselves, we can only defeat Germany as we did in World War I if the Soviet Union's an ally. But Soviet Union was very uncooperative about Czechoslovakia and had its own long history with Poland. So when the British put out feelers and the French to the Soviet Union and said, why don't we deter Germany by suggesting that if they go into Czechoslovakia or they dismantle it or they go into Poland, they will be attacked on two sides, and Stalin wanted no part of that. And that's one of the reasons he had the non-aggression pact, as you point out, because he wanted Hitler to destroy the democracies and in the process destroy Germany, and then he would walk in and clean up the easy spoils.
Japan. The defeats and the successes in against the Japanese front in Manchuria are given credit to the General Zhukov, who has advanced to take control of the field. And he defeats the Japanese forces in such a fashion that my understanding is the Japanese Navy and the Japanese Army then decide they could not attack in Asia because of the Russian army. So that moved them to attack the U.S. in Pearl Harbor. Is that a correct generality?
I think it is. I think right before Pearl Harbor, and remember what shocked the Japanese was the August 23rd Russian-Germany deal, because they were fighting on the Eastern Front against the Russians, and all of a sudden the Japanese were sold out. And they got back at the Germans in April of 41. They said, you did that to us, we're going to do this. And they signed a non-aggression pact with Stalin. But what turned them toward us and the British were the facts, and that was the Navy and the Army Air Force went to the Army and said, in this 80 years of westernization, we have achieved parity with carriers, battleships, destroyers, and with fighter aircraft and torpedo aircraft and dive bombers. You haven't. You don't have European style or Russian style tanks. You don't have good artillery. You don't have good light weaponry, and you cannot compete with a Western army in a conventional fight. Maybe in Burma or China or against non-Western armies, or maybe on the defensive, as we would learn in Iwo Jima and Okinawa, but not in a wide blitzkrieg type of fight. So if we are going to fight these colonial powers, then it has to be a Navy, Air Force predominance, and we have to take out Singapore, the Philippines. And there was one other wild card, and that was the Japanese were eyeing these orphaned European colonies, specifically Southeast Asia, and specifically the Dutch East Indies, Indonesia, where all the shell oil fields were. And they thought, to aggregate this, and they took the Southeast Asia in 1940, but they thought, we can just take all of these European spoils, and while Britain's under attack, we'll take the rubber of Malaysia, we'll take the oil of the Dutch East Indies, and we'll knock out the U.S. fleet. And that was all going to be primarily an amphibious air and naval project. It was not going to be conventional, slugging it out with a Western power and a conventional battlefield.
Victor Davis Hanson is a classicist and an historian. His book, The Second World Wars, makes the point that Sean McMeekin is making in his book, that these are a series of conflicts, an amalgamation, in Anthony Beevor's terms, an amalgamation of wars that we now remember decades later as the Second World War. That is not articulate for the geostrategy of the time that still influences decisions made in Moscow, in Berlin, in London, in Paris. It is all integrated. This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor.